This is Tom Does Tech. I'm Tom, and this is the second video in the URL shortener series where we're going to build a full stack URL shortener. In this video, we're going to build out the user interface. So we're going to start by bootstrapping the application with Create React App. We're going to move on to making the network request. And then we're going to fix a few bugs in the backend. We're going to enable cause and validate the URL. And then we're going to finish off by creating a background image. So first, let's have a look at what we'll be creating. So this is the URL shortener. You can put in a URL here, and it will create a short URL for you. If you follow that URL, it'll take you to your destination. And when we resize the screen, we'll get a new background image that's perfectly sized to the new size of the screen. So let's start by bootstrapping the application and doing a little bit of cleanup. So we'll use npx create react app, and we'll use the TypeScript template. So now that we've finished bootstrapping the application, let's come in and do a little bit of cleanup. So we can remove app.css, we can remove the contents of app.tsx, we can remove the React import and the logo, remove the logo file, and we can remove the contents of index.css. Now we'll install the required dependencies. So we're going to be using Chakra UI and Axios. Chakra UI is a React component library, and we'll use Axios to make the network request. But you can use any module to make the network request. You can use fetch if you don't want to install anything. And we'll make a configuration file so we can set the server's endpoint, because that's going to change from development to production. So cd into the UI, cd into source, make a new directory called config, and create a new file inside config called index.ts. And we'll open up our index file, and we'll say export const server endpoint. So when you're using environment variables in Create React App, you need to prefix them with React App, and then you can call the environment variable what you like. And in this case, we're going to make it equal to that environment variable, or localhost 4000, so we don't need to configure this in dev. So now that we have our server endpoint configured, we can come into index.tsx and we can import Chakra provider and wrap our application in the Chakra provider. And that will allow us to use Chakra UI throughout the application. So next, come into source and create a new folder called components. And we're going to create one component for the URL shortener form. And we're just going to return a div for now that just says hi. And then we can come back to our app.tsx. And we can import a URL shortener form. We've also deleted app.css, so we'll need to remove that import. And we can render our component here. Cd back into the root directory of the user interface and yarn start to start the server. Looks like we also need to install Emotion, which is the CSS library that Chakra UI relies on. So we can start our server again. We also need to install Emotion/styled. We also need to install this frame emotion. Just for a little bit of context, the reason I leave these mistakes in is because that's the feedback I've got. I could cut them out and make everything perfect, but you wouldn't see the actual mistakes that go into making something. And you can always learn something from mistakes. So we'll restart the server again, and third time lucky. And we have our div that just renders hi. So we can start building out our URL shortener form. So we're going to import Axios from Axios. And this is what we're going to use to make our network requests. We can import useState from React. And we'll import a few components from Chakra UI. So let's change our div to a box. And a box is just a generic component that you can apply style to. So we can say here that we want our position to be relative. And so the alternative to this would be to create a div and do inline styles. So but this is just a little bit nicer. So we can create a form, and we can create a submit handler. Which needs to be an async function. And on submit equals handle submit. And this will pass in the event. And the event is type of React.form event, and it takes a HTML form element in the generic type. And so we need to say event.prevent default, so the page doesn't refresh when we submit the form. And then we can create our submit button. And we'll give this a type of submit. So when the user clicks this button, the form will be submitted and our form handler will be executed. So let's just do let's put a debugger statement in here, and we'll come back over to our browser and we'll inspect. Execute, and we get our debugger, and we can continue through. So we can leave this in here so we can see what the URL shortener handle submit method is going to be called with. So let's make a state property. So if you remember from the last video, our URL shortener create handler takes one input, and that is destination. So if this was a more complex form, I definitely would not be using useState to handle these inputs. I would be using a form library like Formic or React Hook Forms, preferably React Hook Forms. But because we only have one input, using state is perfectly fine. So let's create our input. So our input takes a change handler that calls setDestination with the value of what's in the input. So if we print this destination to the screen, we should be able to see it updating as we type in the form. So if we type in here, Google, we can see that it is updating our destination state. So we need to import our server endpoint from our config file. And then we can create the network request with Axios. So this is going to send a post request to our server/API/URL, and it's going to put destination in the body of the post request. And then we can console.log result. And if we come over to our application, we can put in https example.com, click create short URL. And we can inspect and see what our result is. And it looks like we've got a short URL here. So if we come over to our application, put in example.com. So if we come over to our application and put in example.com and click create short URL, we will get an error because we haven't started our server. So if we open a new terminal, start our server, clear our network requests and click create again. We're getting another error. So this error, is a cause error. So if we have a look in the terminal, we can see exactly what's going on. We have no access control origin header set. So if we look in the network request, we can see that that header doesn't exist. So we're going to need to update our server to allow requests from localhost port 3000. So let's open up our server. And if you remember in the last video, we installed a plugin called Cause. So we can import cause from cause. Then we can say app.use cause. Sorry, that's an object. And cause is going to take one property, and that is the origin. So we want to put the origin inside of our config. But first, let's install the types for cause. First, let's install the types for cause. And we'll install that as a dev dependency. Come over to our config. We'll say cause origin. The cause origin is localhost port 3000. So if we save that, we can use our config.get method, and we're going to get that config. And origin has 2 eyes in it. And if we start our server again, come back over to our user interface, click create short URL. And you can see that it successfully created a short URL. And if we go back to the network request, we can see that the response headers have this allow access control origin is set to localhost port 3000. So that's what this cause origin config will do. And while we're in the server, there's one more problem with our server. So if we come over to the form and put in, Google. So if we come over to the form and put in Google, which is not a valid URL, and click create short URL, we can see that the request was accepted and our destination is just Google. So if we try go to that short URL, we will be redirected to /Google. So we need to make sure that the domain that they're putting in here is a valid URL. Come over to the create short URL schema, and you can see that we're just requiring a string here. So if we do string.url, we can supply an error message, must be a valid URL. Then come back over to the client application and try submit Google again. We get an error that says must be a valid URL. Now that we're validating that the input will only take a valid URL, we can display the short URL when it's generated so the user can click on it and double check that it works. So we'll use a state parameter to set the short URL, and then we can display this on the screen once it's been set. So we can do set short URL is equal to result. And we can display short URL below the form. And we use JSON.stringify, and we'll just print the whole object to the screen for now. And we can see here that we get the short URL. So the short URL is going to be an anchor. It just says click me. And the href is going to be equal to the server endpoint / short URL dot short ID. And we can make this a template string. And we'll wrap this in a if statement, so it only gets printed when there is a valid short URL. And before the user, when the user submits the form, we need to set short URL to null, and we can say Google create short URL, and if we click this, it will redirect us to Google. So the next part is to create the background image. So if we come over to components, and we'll create a new component called background.tsx, and we'll import image from Chakra UI. We'll create a component called background and we'll export it as default. And our background will return an image. And the image source is just going to be the Unsplash endpoint for random images /width/height. So we need to get the width and height for the screen. So we can create a function that gets the width and the height from the window object. And then we can create a state parameter that gets the window's width and height as the default. So we need to import useState from React. But we also want this width and height to change when we change the screen's width and height. So we can use effect to add an event listener to the window. So when the window is resized, it will recalculate the window's width and height, and it will update our window dimensions object. So we can extract this hook into a custom hook component. And then in our background component, we can use the hook and get the window's width and height. So for now, let's just return a div, and we'll just say width times height. And we can get rid of this width. Let's come back to our index.tsx. Sorry, our app.tsx, and we can import our background component, and we'll render that under the short URL form. Let's have a look at our window. We can see that we're working with 3008 pixels wide by 653, and when we resize our window, those dimensions will change. Come back to our background component, and this time we'll return our image. And our image is position fixed, and it has a source of the image that comes from Unsplash. And the image that comes from Unsplash will be sized to our window. So if we come back and have a look at our page, we can see that we have a very large image, but no URL shortener form. So we need to change the Z index of our shortener form. So we can see the Z index of the background is 1. So the Z index of the form needs to be more than 1. We'll have a look again and we can see our form. So let's make our form stand out a little bit and center it. So if we give this a background color of white, we'll give it a little bit of padding, and we'll come back to our app.tsx, and we'll wrap these two components in a box from Chakra UI so we can add some styles. So this is looking good. Our form is in the middle horizontally, but we also want it in the middle vertically. So to do that, we need all these elements, so HTML and body and the root element to have a height of 100%. So if we come back to our index.css, we can say HTML, body, and the root all have a height of 100%. And our form is perfectly centered in the middle of the page. So the last thing we need to do is wrap the input and the button in an input group. So if we get input group from Chakra UI and wrap the two, you can see that it puts them all in one line, but the text on the button is just a little bit too long. So I'm just going to say create. Perfect. So you may have noticed that when you create a short URL, the origin is the backend's origin. So in this case, it is localhost port 4000. And that's okay if you want to use a reverse proxy when you deploy the application. But to make deployments easier, we're going to make the origin the client's origin, and then we're going to request the data from the server, and then we're going to handle the redirect on the client. To do this, we're going to need to start by installing React Router DOM. So yarn add React Router DOM, then install the types package for React Router DOM. And while that's installing, we can start doing a little bit of refactoring. So we'll create a new folder called containers, and we'll make a home container, and we'll move the contents of our app.tsx into home. Then we'll come back to app.tsx and we will import the home container and then replace the contents with the home container. And we can import React Router DOM. So we need browser router, switch, and router. And sorry, we can remove this. Sorry, we can remove home container and we will instead return the router, which will return home container for the index path. And then for /short URL, we're going to return this handle redirect container. And we just need to fix home by adding a return statement. And that will fix the index route. And then we need to create this handle redirect container. And then import the handle redirect container from the containers folder. And we can start working on our handle redirect. So we're going to import Axios from Axios. We're going to import a couple of functions from React. So we're going to need use effect and use callback. Sorry, use state. And we're also going to need the server endpoint again. We're going to need to import use route match from React Router DOM. And we're going to import some components from Chakra UI. So we need to set two state parameters, so our destination and an error. And then we can get our short ID from the use route match. And this is typed here, so short ID will be in params. So if we remove this type, then you'll see that we'll get a type error if we try use short ID. So this is telling us what we're expecting in params. So the first thing we need to do is to get our short ID. So on our server, we have an API endpoint for /API/URL and gets the short ID. And then we're setting the destination state with the result of that query. And if we encounter an error, such as a 404, then we'll set the error message. And then once we have a destination, we will use the window.location.replace, which simulates a HTTP redirect, and will redirect to the destination. So if the destination is not defined and we also don't have an error, then it means that the page is loading and we just want to return a spinner. But if that's not the case, then we want to show the user the error message. The most likely error message is a 404. So we can start this client again. And while that's starting, we can go over to our home container and then into the URL shortener form. And we'll replace this server endpoint with just /. So it will use the origin. And then when we display the URL, we're going to display window.location.origin. Come back over to our application and create a new short URL. And you can see here that we have localhost port 3000. So this will be our domain. And then if we open that in a new tab, we should see a loading spinner flash, and then we get redirected. So that's it for creating the UI for the URL shortener. Join me in the next video where we will deploy the application. So please like the video and subscribe. Thank you for watching.